There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard or sleeping too little. Uh, it settles in even on days when nothing particularly bad has happened. You wake up, move through your routines, answer the messages, show up where you're supposed to show up, and yet something feels thin, distant, like you're present for your own life, but not fully inside it. If we're honest with ourselves, most people don't talk about that feeling out loud. We scroll past it, we joke about it, we tell ourselves it's just stress, just the pace of things, just another phase we'll power through. But the truth is, that sense of disconnection isn't random, it isn't weakness, and it isn't just in your head, because human beings were never designed to live in a constant state of partial attention. We weren't built to hold 100 conversations without depth, to absorb endless streams of information without meaning, to perform ourselves instead of inhabiting ourselves. And yet, that's what much of modern life quietly demands. There's a paradox here that's hard to ignore. We are more connected than any generation in history, and more people feel alone. We can reach anyone, anywhere, at any time, and still feel unseen by the people closest to us. We have tools that promise efficiency and freedom, yet so many of us feel scattered, numb, stretched thin in ways we can't quite explain. Most people overlook this part. Disconnection is often the body's response to overload. When everything is urgent, nothing feels intimate. When every moment is filled, none of them are fully felt. And over time, the nervous system adapts not by leaning in, but by pulling back, by dimming sensation, by choosing distance over depletion. That's not apathy, that's self-protection. I've seen it show up in all kinds of people, smart people, caring people, people who love deeply and still feel far away from themselves. They don't lack gratitude. They lack space, space to process, space to feel, space to be human without an audience. And what's striking is how often this disconnection is mistaken for something else. People assume they're falling out of love, losing motivation, becoming cynical. But beneath all of that, there's usually a quieter truth. They're overwhelmed by a world that never lets them fully arrive anywhere, not even in their own lives. We live in an age that rewards responsiveness over reflection, speed over depth, reaction over understanding. And when that becomes the default, something essential begins to erode. The ability to listen without planning your reply, the capacity to sit with discomfort long enough for it to teach you something, the simple grounding experience of being with another person without distraction or performance. That erosion doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually. In skipped conversations, in meals eaten while scrolling, in moments of silence filled with noise, until one day you realize that even joy feels muted, that sadness feels vague, that life is happening but at arm's length. And that's when the question begins to surface. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet wondering that follows you home at night. Why do I feel so far away from everything, even when I'm right here? That question doesn't usually arrive with drama. It arrives in ordinary moments. Standing in line at a store, phone in hand, forgetting why you opened it in the first place, sitting across from someone you care about, nodding at the right times, while your mind drifts somewhere safer, quieter, less demanding. Lying in bed at night, exhausted but unable to rest, because your thoughts refuse to settle into anything coherent. Context matters here. Because this sense of disconnection didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew out of a particular moment in history, one defined by acceleration, faster news cycles, faster work days, faster opinions, faster judgments, and beneath all that speed, a steady erosion of the spaces where meaning used to take root. For most of human history, life moved at the pace of conversation, of seasons, of shared labor. You knew the people who grew your food. You argued face to face. You mourned together. You celebrated together. And when hardship came, and it always did, it came wrapped in community. But somewhere along the way, convenience replaced closeness. Efficiency replaced presence. We built systems that saved time, but we never quite figured out what to do with the time we saved, so we filled it with notifications, with updates, with noise, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, our inner lives began to flatten. Technology promised to connect us, and in many ways it did. Families separated by oceans could see each other's faces. Movements could organize in days instead of years. Voices that had been ignored found platforms. Those gains are real. They matter. But there was a cost we didn't fully anticipate. When connection becomes constant, it loses texture. When every moment is shared, few moments are digested. When identity becomes something we curate instead of something we inhabit, we begin to experience ourselves from the outside in. And that's where disconnection takes root. Not because we don't care, but because caring requires a kind of sustained attention that modern life rarely allows. It requires slowness, vulnerability, the willingness to be bored, to be uncertain, to sit with feelings that don't resolve neatly. There's also fear woven into this story. Fear of being left behind, fear of missing out, fear of silence, because silence asks questions we might not be ready to answer. So we stay busy, we stay reachable, we stay distracted, and in doing so, we slowly lose touch with the quieter signals of our own hearts. I think about the years when I was organizing in Chicago. Long days, low pay, a lot of doors closed in our faces. But there was also something grounding about that work. You sat across from people, you listened to their stories. You felt the weight of their frustrations and the stubbornness of their hope. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't clean, but it was real. And real connection, whether between neighbors, partners, or citizens, has always been a little inconvenient. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes the humility to admit you don't have all the answers. In the White House, that lesson didn't disappear, it sharpened. Decisions carried consequences for millions of people, but the danger was always abstraction, spreadsheets instead of stories, metrics instead of lives. You had to work against that pull to remember that behind every policy debate were human beings trying to hold their families together, trying to make sense of a world that felt increasingly unforgiving. Disconnection thrives when systems forget people, but it also thrives when people forget themselves. When we confuse productivity with worth, when we confuse visibility with value, when we confuse constant stimulation with fulfillment, and maybe that's why so many people feel disconnected, even when things look fine on the surface, they're doing what they were told would lead to happiness, working hard, staying informed, staying connected, and yet something essential feels missing. Not excitement, not success, meaning the body knows this before the mind does. It shows up as fatigue that rest doesn't fix, as irritability without a clear cause, as a low-grade sadness that doesn't quite qualify as despair but doesn't lift either. These are signals, not failures, signals that the pace and shape of our lives may be out of alignment with the kind of creatures we actually are. We are relational beings. We regulate each other's nervous systems. We find ourselves through one another. And when those bonds are thinned out by distance, by distraction, by distrust, the result isn't just loneliness, it's disorientation. So if you've been feeling disconnected, it may not be because you're doing something wrong. It may be because you're responding normally to an environment that asks too much and gives too little in return. The deeper question, then, isn't how do I fix myself, but what would it look like to rebuild a life and a culture that makes connection possible again? That rebuilding doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with small, almost radical choices, choosing to pause before reacting, choosing to listen without preparing your next reply, choosing to let a conversation linger past its usefulness. These moments don't trend, they don't announce themselves, but they restore something essential, the sense that you are not alone inside your own experience. We've also underestimated how much grief people are carrying. Grief for lost routines, lost relationships, lost versions of themselves, entire chapters closed without ceremony, jobs that vanished, communities that scattered, expectations that no longer fit the world as it is. And grief, when it isn't acknowledged, doesn't disappear. It disguises itself as numbness, as cynicism, as disengagement. Disconnection is often a protective response. When the world feels unstable, when trust feels fragile, pulling back can feel safer than leaning in. That instinct makes sense. But over time, protection can harden into isolation. And isolation, left unchecked, can begin to convince us that our struggles are unique, that everyone else has figured something out that we somehow missed. That's one of the quiet lies of this era. Scroll long enough and you'll see curated joy, curated certainty, curated confidence, rarely doubt, rarely confusion, rarely the messy middle where most real lives actually live. And when you measure your inner chaos against someone else's edited calm, disconnection deepens. I saw versions of this even before social media took its current form. In politics, especially, there's a temptation to perform certainty, to project strength by never admitting uncertainty. But some of the most meaningful moments I witnessed came when people spoke honestly about what they didn't know, what they feared, what they were still trying to understand. Those moments didn't weaken leadership, they humanized it. The same is true in our personal lives. Connection doesn't require perfection, it requires presence. It requires the courage to say, I'm not okay, without immediately trying to solve it. To sit with someone else's discomfort without rushing to fix it, to allow silence to do some of the work. There's also a civic dimension to all this. A disconnected society is easier to divide. When people no longer see one another as whole human beings, complex, contradictory, worthy of care, it becomes easier to reduce them to labels, to assume bad faith, to retreat into tribes that feel safer because they demand less empathy. Democracy depends on a baseline of connection, not agreement, connection. The ability to imagine that the person on the other side of an argument loves their family, worries about their future, and wants to be seen just as much as you do. When that imagination erodes, trust follows. And when trust collapses, so does the willingness to build anything together. That's why this feeling you've been carrying matters. It's not just personal, it's political, it's cultural. It's a signal that something in the way we're living together needs attention. Reconnection, then, is not about retreating from the world, it's about engaging it differently, with boundaries, with intention, with an understanding that attention is a finite resource, and where you place it shapes who you become. It might mean fewer conversations, but deeper ones. Fewer inputs, but more reflection. Less performance, more presence. These choices won't fix everything, but they create the conditions where meaning can reemerge, where relationships can breathe, where the self you recognize in quiet moments can begin to feel integrated again. And maybe that's the quiet hope embedded in all of this. That disconnection, painful as it is, can also be an invitation to re-examine what we value, how we measure success, how we define a good life. So I'll leave you with this to sit with. When was the last time you felt truly seen? Not for what you produce or project, but for who you are beneath all that. What habits, if gently loosened, might make room for that feeling again? And what would change, not just for you, but for all of us, if we chose presence over performance even a little more often? I think about how often we confuse connectivity with closeness. We count the messages, the likes, the meetings, the calendars packed tight, but closeness doesn't live in quantity, it lives in quality. It lives in the space where someone knows your story well enough to notice when a chapter has shifted. And that kind of knowing takes time, it takes patience, it takes a willingness to be interrupted by another person's reality. When I was organizing in Chicago, long before smartphones sat in our pockets, connection moved at a different pace. You knocked on doors, you sat at kitchen tables, you listened more than you spoke, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be invited back. And people didn't always agree with you. In fact, they often didn't. But there was a shared understanding that the conversation itself mattered, that showing up counted for something. Somewhere along the way, we started optimizing those moments out of existence. Efficiency replaced intimacy, speed replaced depth, and while we gained convenience, we lost some of the friction that once forced us to slow down and really see one another. Friction isn't always a flaw. Sometimes it's where understanding is forged. You can feel the cost of that loss in the way conversations end before they begin, in the way we talk past each other, not to each other, in the way silence now feels awkward instead of spacious. And when silence becomes something to fear, reflection disappears with it. That matters because reflection is where meaning settles. It's where you integrate your experiences instead of just surviving them. Without it, life becomes a series of reactions, one notification to the next, one crisis to the next. And eventually, the self that's reacting starts to feel thinner, less anchored, less real. I've felt that thinning myself, even in the Oval Office, maybe especially there. Surrounded by people, briefings, decisions that carried enormous weight, there were moments of profound isolation. Moments when the noise was so constant that it drowned out the quieter voice you need to hear if you're going to lead with integrity. That voice doesn't shout, it waits. And if you never stop moving, you miss it. Disconnection then isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about being overwhelmed. Too many inputs, too many roles, too many expectations layered on top of a human nervous system that hasn't evolved to process the world at this speed. When that happens, numbness can feel like relief. Pulling back can feel like survival. But survival isn't the same as living. And numbness, over time, asks a steep price. It dulls joy along with pain. It shrinks curiosity. It narrows empathy. And before you know it, the world feels flatter than it used to, less colorful, less surprising. If this reflection has stirred something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, what you've learned about love, stress, and safety along the way. Subscribe if you want to keep having these quieter, deeper conversations. Not for noise, but for understanding. This isn't about nostalgia. It's not about rejecting technology or pretending we can go back to some simpler time. It's about discernment, about deciding consciously what deserves your full attention and what doesn't, about remembering that attention is an act of care, and where you place it shapes not just your relationships, but your sense of self. If you've been feeling disconnected, maybe it's because some part of you knows this already, knows that the pace is unsustainable, knows that something essential has been crowded out. That feeling isn't a personal failure, it's feedback. Because beneath the noise, beneath the disconnection, the capacity for connection hasn't disappeared. It's waiting, waiting for presence, waiting for courage, waiting for us to remember that being human was never meant to be done alone. What would it look like to take that pause today? Who might you see differently if you slowed down long enough to really look? And what kind of world becomes possible when we choose again and again to be present with one another, even when it's hard.